Time. Thank you. I always forget about that person in the room. We are living in a time of great uncertainty. We are living in a time of great possibility. We can grow the life sustaining possibilities together. I love the reading Jane just offered, the words of Robert Walsh. Growing up in the Bay Area, I always knew the ground wasn't as stable as it seems. My father was a seismologist. He studied earthquakes. In the lobby of his office at the U.S. Geological Survey, there was a model city. When you pushed the little red button at the base of the display case, you'd trigger a quake. The buildings would suddenly jerk and then start to sway. The tallest buildings, the ones that symbolize human ingenuity and power, they swayed the most. What does it mean to live on unstable ground? What can we trust? Although earthquakes are hardly the focus of our concern these days, we know disruption. We know how quickly life can be upended. But do we know how to live amidst the shakiness, the uncertainty? Turn to love, our Unitarian Universalist faith tells us. Place your trust in those tensile strands of love that bend and stretch to hold us in the web of life, says Robert Walsh. This advice sounds beautiful and also deeply true. But how do we actually do it? How do we trust the tensile strands of love when the momentum all around us is business as usual, as fast as possible? One day in September, I turned on the car radio to catch the tail end of a news story about how the pandemic has impacted the global supply chain. It's going to be increasingly difficult to get products made in China, the guest was saying. The host asked the guest what we should do since we rely so much on products made in China. The answer? Start your holiday shopping now. The host chuckled and ended the show. It was September. I was stunned. Really? That's the advice we're being given? The ground shifts beneath our feet. The order we've come to know fractures, and we're told to hurry up and shop? Sadly, this is one of the dominant messages of our time. Buddhist scholar and activist Joanna Macy calls it the story of business as usual. In this story, the central plot is about getting ahead, competition, individualism, economic growth by any means necessary. In the story of business as usual, our individual worth is measured by how productive we are, and our individual success is defined by how many resources we lay claim to. This has been the dominant story for a long time, and we know where it leads. Albert Einstein famously said that we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. In religious community and in society at large, rushing back to the old ways of doing things isn't the only possibility for restoring a sense of well-being in these fearful times. There are other possibilities. It's hard not to fall back into the old patterns, though. Hard not to grasp for the sense of solidity and control some of us once had and all of us probably long for. It's especially hard when we are deluged with reports about how dire our situation is. The mutating virus, fires, drought, hurricanes and floods, assaults on democracy and women's rights, the shoring up of white supremacy, the mass extinction of species. In August, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report that the United Nations called a Code Red for humanity. Many people saw the headlines but didn't read the articles. We're way too overwhelmed already. Feeling helpless in the face of such staggering problems and hearing repeatedly that we must return to business as usual, is it any wonder that many people feel even more frantic than they were before the pandemic? That many are working longer hours with fewer breaks, even when working from home? Is it any wonder that volunteer organizations, including religious communities, are experiencing volunteer shortages and burnout? Even though we've had 20 months of relative isolation and suspension, many of us feel we haven't had the mental, emotional, and sometimes even the physical space to assess where we are, how we are, and what our wisest response might be to the situation in which we find ourselves. Business as usual doesn't allow it. Early in the pandemic, in April of 2020, author and activist Arundhati Roy wrote an essay titled "The Pandemic is a Portal." Historically, Roy said in that article, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our databanks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through it lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. When I read those words by Arundhati Roy in the spring of 2020, I grasped onto the idea of the pandemic as a portal like a drowning person would a life raft. It gave me a sense of hope. Hope that maybe with the disruption of a global pandemic, we could all stop business as usual, agree on how bad things have become, and really start to change. Recently, as some things slowly start returning to what we think of as normal, I have felt some resistance, in part because I don't want us to miss this window of opportunity. I know it's unrealistic to think we'd turn the ship around in the time it takes to pass through a pandemic. I know it's going to take generations. But the ferocity with which I grasp the possibility that the pandemic might be a portal to a more livable future tells me how badly I want this change. And it also reminds me to check my urgency thinking, my desire for a quick fix. That too is part of business as usual. If I want to participate in the transition to a more livable future, I need to start living differently now, and that involves slowing down and radically shifting my focus. Shifting one's focus can be incredibly powerful. During an interfaith New Year's Eve service in Washington, D.C. in 2016, Sikh activist and civil rights attorney Valerie Kaur gave a short speech that immediately went viral. Some of you may have seen it. Held between the 2016 presidential election and the inauguration, it was a solemn service, a vigil. Valerie Kaur's uncle, Balbir Sodhi Singh, was the first person killed in a hate crime in this country after 9/11. She, like so many others across the country and around the world, had good reason to be afraid that New Year's Eve in 2016. Even watching the video, you can sense the dread and despair in the room. But that energy changed when Valerie Kaur offered a new lens on the situation. Here's what she said. Yes, the future is dark. On this New Year's Eve, this watch night, I close my eyes and I see the darkness of my grandfather's cell, where he was detained for months upon arriving in the U.S. And I can feel the spirit of ever-rising optimism in the Sikh tradition, Chardi Kala, within him. So the mother in me asks, what if, she said. What if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? What if our America is not dead, but a country that is waiting to be born? What if the story of America is one long labor? What if all our grandfathers and grandmothers are standing behind us now, those who survived occupation and genocide, slavery and Jim Crow, detentions and political assault? What if they are whispering in our ears, "You are brave"? What if this is our nation's greatest transition? This reframing of a fearful era, not as the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb, struck a chord. The sanctuary erupted in applause when she said it. The video of Kaur's speech has been viewed over 40 million times around the world and led her to create the Revolutionary Love Project, based on the idea that we who believe in justice are in labor together, breathing and pushing to bring to life a society based on love. What was so powerful about Valerie Kaur's speech that night was that she acknowledged the fear and despair, and she reminded us that uncertainty also means possibility. And she invited us to focus on that, on the possibility of transformation, to place our energies there. And she provided a sense of collective hope, collective strength, stretching out behind and in front of us. Generations laboring together in a great turning toward love and justice. Joanna Macy and others use the term the Great Turning to describe a slow and momentous transition away from an individualistic industrial society committed to economic growth to a life-sustaining society committed to the healing and recovery of our world. The Great Turning, Macy writes, involves the emergence of new and creative human responses to the crises of our times. I'm constantly relearning that the Great Turning isn't going to happen all at once. In fact, it's already happening, and it's been happening here and there, bit by bit, small turn by small turn. Each time the ground shifts beneath us and our sense of order fractures, we have the opportunity to turn toward the uncertainty, toward the breakdown, and find there in the mess and chaos sources of sustenance, healing, and regeneration, and then to align ourselves with the life-giving forces already at work. One last story. In July, my family and I were able to visit loved ones in New Hampshire. It was raining when we landed in Boston, pouring hard. Coming from scorched California, the rain felt nourishing. See how green everything is? I asked the kids. It's because of the rain. I knew the rain wouldn't last long. Storms blow through all the time in New England, but they don't stay. Except now, apparently, they do. It was the wettest July on record in that part of the Northeast. The rain didn't stop, and it was cold and gray, and we hadn't packed enough warm clothes. It didn't take me long to unravel. Trauma experts tell us to expect this. These little moments of melting down over minor disappointments or setbacks is part of a normal response to large disruptive events, to trauma. I was down about the weather for days. Eventually, though, I remembered that I had a choice. I decided to focus on the possibilities. We made a poster listing all the many blessings of rain. We made an idea jar full of fun things to do in the rain. And most importantly, we did what anyone who has ever lived in Seattle knows to do. We went outside in the rain. We went into the dripping wet woods and into the rising swamps. And there we discovered something truly transformative: mushrooms. I've never seen so many different kinds of fungus. Yellow, red, white, brown, orange, polka-dotted, even lavender mushrooms. Huge dinner-sized plate-sized fungi stuck to the trunks of trees. Tiny toadstool-shaped mushrooms barely larger than a grain of rice. Delicate tubular fungi with little gaping mouths. Fleshy mushrooms, slimy mushrooms. Some were beautiful, others grotesque. It was incredible. Every day there was more rain and more mushrooms, more variety, more life. For the remainder of the trip, I was like a child on a treasure hunt, eagerly searching for the next exquisite fungi, mucking around in the rain, squealing with delight. Social justice facilitator and birth doula Adrienne Marie Brown writes that we need new models for how to survive and thrive in times of breakdown and transition. Instead of modeling ourselves after machines or gods or endangered predators like lions or bears, we need to focus instead on the collaborative and resilient species. Humble life forms that proliferate and thrive in difficult, changing circumstances. Dandelions, ants, fungi. What can we learn from them? One of the first mushrooms I noticed in New Hampshire was so strong and sturdy, it lifted a thick mound of wet pine needles over its head as it grew. Bending over, I could see spidery white filaments in the decomposing pine needles. And when I pulled back the carpet of needles, I found the thick, intricate lacework of mycelium. Mycelium is the vegetative part of a fungus, the network of filaments that is the life form itself. Mushrooms are just the fruiting bodies of this living network. The real action happens in the wet darkness below the mushroom, in the mycelium. What can we learn from a life form that is, literally, a network? How might we behave differently if we thought of ourselves as a network too, as the fruiting bodies of the web of life? As individuals, we are like mushrooms, wildly, extravagantly diverse, but we only exist because of the critical connections we usually fail to see. The connections that sustain us, our mycelium, the living, reaching, responsive web that is our life, our truth, whether we acknowledge it or not. I've heard it said, and I believe that it's true, that the single most important thing any individual can do to address climate change, and I'd add pandemics too, is to stop thinking of oneself as an individual. If we stop listening to the story of business as usual and start tuning in to the evidence of interdependence all around us, we can make this catalytic change. There's no such thing as a blank canvas, an empty land, or a new idea, Adrienne Maree Brown writes. But everywhere there is complex, ancient, fertile ground full of potential. Can we let go of our fantasies of domination and control so we can learn the art of collective flourishing? I believe that we can, and that our Unitarian Universalist faith can support us in doing so. Unitarian Universalism is a very this-worldly religion. If heaven and hell exist at all, we often say, they exist right here on earth. Beauty and brokenness, good and evil, chaos and possibility right here, inside and all around us. And our highest calling as human beings is to recognize this truth, tend to the brokenness, appreciate the beauty, and grow the good. So I invite you this week to reflect on what life-giving possibilities you can find in the midst of these uncertain times, possibilities that you can help grow. As UU communities, what is your role in this time of transition? My most fervent hope is that together we can learn not only to live well inside transition, but that we choose to intentionally participate in it, helping to shape what is to come with love and justice. May it be so.